Hey, Heaton, thanks so much for doing this.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah.
How long is this going to take?
Well, the setup is probably going to be about 30 minutes to get all the cameras and the sound check and all that. But then once we start filming, about an hour.
Okay, sounds great.
Wonderful.
I thought you'd said this would take an hour to film, and it's been longer than that already.
I know, usually we are running on time, but you'll recall our camera 3 failed, so we had to restart that, and then you wanted a 15-minute bio break, so we're running a little bit behind, but I think we'll catch up as we continue.
Got it. Well, haven't you been doing this for a while? Wouldn't you already know how to do this very well?
Yeah, I mean, I have done 50 episodes, and they've all run on time. It just so happens that for some reason today, camera 3 decided to fail, and we've had to do a restart, so hope you can bear with us.
Got it. Well, your lack of sticking to a timeline seems very unprofessional to me.
Okay, well, do you want to continue filming or should we stop?
I'm going to take a minute
Okay.
and cancel my next meeting.
Okay.
Because this has been unprofessional, as I said, and I'll
Right.
be back. So I'll need another few minutes before we can start again.
Okay, got it. Well, I'm sorry you have to cancel your next meeting.
Yeah, well, if you're really good at doing this, you would actually have accurate estimates, and it seems like you don't. So we're going to have to talk about that now.
Well, funny you should say that because in today's episode, we're actually going to be talking about how to do accurate or maybe inaccurate estimates. So hope you'll
Great.
stick around for that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Welcome to Build, brought to you by Pivotal Tracker. I'm your host, Purnima Vijay Shankar. In each episode of Build, innovators and I debunk a number of myths and misconceptions related to building products, companies, and your career in tech. Now, one of the most elusive processes has to be estimating how long a project or a task is going to take. And no matter how many times we do it, we somehow just always miss the mark because things come up. Well, in today's episode, we're going to share some of the aftershocks you may experience despite what approach you take when it comes to estimating. And in a future episode, we'll dive into an alternate approach and how your team can adopt and adapt it to fit your needs. And to help us out in this episode, I've invited Heaton Shaw, who is a founder of many products, and his most recent project is called Product Habits. Thanks for joining us today, Heaton.
Thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
Yeah. So you and I have been building products for a number of years. We've built a lot of different ones. And I know myself, being an engineer and a product owner, no matter how many years I put in, I just constantly miss the mark. No matter what, I either end up underestimating or overestimating. So let's dive right in and talk about what are some of the problems that happen when we don't accurately estimate.
Yeah, I think when we're building products, we don't generally think about how long it's going to take to build them, even though we pretend we do. Mm-hmm. So we end up creating a roadmap with a bunch of timelines, and we don't actually talk amongst the team because usually a product can't be built by a single person. If it could have been built by a single person, then you don't have to worry about it as much because that single person has all the answers. So one thing that ends up happening is you end up having surprises that come up that you didn't think of. So you're thinking about using a certain technology, let's say, such as Twilio or SendGrid or an API, and the engineer has never used it before. They get in the weeds of it and they realize it's going to take longer than they think. And then your estimate is blown up and you're off. So that's a very common problem. There's a few others too.
Yeah.
One other one that I've seen people hit continuously is this idea of scope creep. We're both product people. You happen to be an engineer, I happen to be more a marketer, but we love product and building them and teaching other people how to do it too. And so, one of the aspects of that is we might still be learning and doing research as the product is being built. And we all of a sudden have this great idea we want to add, and we go in and kind of blow up the whole process and expect that the timeline's not going to change, or don't even think about the timeline and say, hey, we're going to build this new thing on top of the thing we're doing, or can you add this little tweak, and not realizing how disruptive that is to the process of kind of building the product itself. Another thing that's very common is that if you aren't communicating very well with your team, especially the engineers, when you decide that you're going to build something, what ends up happening is the best thing that they can do if you haven't spent enough time communicating early and often is they end up padding. And they end up actually adding like a whole day, or worse yet, a week or months to a rough estimate.
Yeah.
And we call it a rough estimate because it's rough. And so those are some of the more kind of common problems that come up when you're building something and trying to get estimates and actually think you have the right great estimates, which is the most common thing.
Right.
And then all of a sudden all these things happen that you are probably not conscious to about what kind of problems they cause in terms of being able to ship something on time.
Right. I think two other things I'm curious to hear your take on are large tasks. How do you actually kind of divide them up, and then the follow through? Like, you think you're 80% way there, and then you discover, actually, you just finished like 50%.
Yeah. I see companies creating, even in my own companies, so much work that is not actually broken down enough. And so you might think that it's easy to add a button somewhere. So you say, okay, this is a button. You think it's a small task.
Right.
Maybe you're not the engineer, because oftentimes you're the product person, or even if you are the engineer.
Right.
And then the engineer, whether you decided to do it as the engineer or the product person, you get into the task and all of a sudden you're like, I have to add the button. There's all these other things that need to change, whether it's the user interface or you're missing a certain component, or what that button does is more complicated than you thought. So what ends up happening is this seemingly small task is actually a large task. And it's usually because you haven't thought through all the things that you need to think through when you add something like that. And I'm talking about a button.
Right.
Imagine a whole feature, right? And considering that to be a small task when it really turns into a large one. So I think the most common thing I see is that these things you consider small are actually large. Another common thing is not realizing that what you're asking for is actually a large task.
Right.
Right? Like adding a messaging feature or things like that. And even like a lot of times, like I've had emails come into me from people who are customers saying, oh, you can send me SMSs as notifications. It'll take 1 hour using Twilio, another 2 hours doing your database, and
Great,
you're done.
come on
I'm
down and write it for us.
You want to do it for me? I'll hold you to the 3 hours, because it's never as long as
Right.
People say it is.
Yeah. So there's a lot of different approaches we also like to take when it does come to estimating. So even though we know all these problems, we still continue to take an approach, right? Let's dive into like the approaches.
Yeah, I think one of the most common approaches that is very still operated by in a lot of companies is, I think, what we call waterfall, which is one task happens after another task, and a lot of times people are waiting on these things.
Right.
And this is actually the reason another process was invented called Agile, which
Yeah.
I know both of us are familiar with, where you're essentially, the way I would describe it is you're trying to do things much more efficiently by basically having more regular meetings and having, I guess, smaller batches of work. And what ends up happening there is you create this sort of system that works almost on a weekly basis at best. And it means that you have a cadence of following up on all the tasks, and sort of, we call it agile because you're supposed to be more agile with it, and it's more nimble than waterfall, and that's completely true.
Right.
But it loses a lot. You lose a lot in the process. And so those are the two kind of common ways that I'm sort of most familiar with. Then there's a third way, which I think is more inspired by things like lean startup, which again, I like to say that we both probably grew up with that, so to speak, around us. And that's where you're even more I would call that more hyper agile than anything else, where you're sort of adding in the component of much more customer feedback in the process, because Agile wasn't necessarily invented at a time when the customer feedback was a popular thing.
Right. So what are some of the painful after effects of using Agile?
Yeah, what ends up happening with Agile, one of my favorites, and there's a lot of tools out there that facilitate this, is the idea of adding points to an Agile process. And so what you end up doing is you're obfuscating time. So you're saying that something that would take 1 to 3 hours is like 1 point, or something that would take 3 to 6 hours is 2 points or 3 points. And they have all these things like Fibonacci sequences, and there's a lot of fanciness around points, when really you're really trying to understand time, not points. And the reason that points exist is because and not that I think this is necessarily bad, it's better than other methods, but some engineers decided that they wanted a metric that wasn't time.
Right.
Right. They literally said it can't be time because we cannot estimate.
Well, because they basically didn't want somebody to know that something was going to take only 15 minutes or 5 hours.
Exactly. So your minimum there is like an hour at best. Oftentimes it's much more. And the thing is, like, every team that I've seen implements Agile with points in different ways. So their whole buckets around the number of points something takes is all different. And then what ends up happening is that engineers now feel great because they have a velocity score.
Right.
And they can talk about how many more points they're doing every week or how many points they're doing every week as a total. And that's really hiding what I would call the truth, which is how long did something actually take.
Yeah. So I know one of the alternatives is to just get rid of estimates altogether, but you've probably experienced what that's like.
Yes.
Let's talk about what results when you get rid of
Sure.
estimates.
So if you get tired of Agile for whatever reason, and usually this happens because somebody that's a non-engineer is really not into it because they don't understand what a point is, even though it has timings and stuff. So then estimates are completely removed, which means points are removed, and then there's just tasks. And then you run into some of the problems from earlier, like is it a small task, is it a big task? If you have, what it really boils down to is if you have no ability to understand how long something's going to take, or even how many points, let's say, then you end up not knowing how to prioritize what you work on.
Yeah.
So if there's just like 10 tasks and all of a sudden the engineer's working on one, and then you ask the engineer, oh, how are you doing? They're like, oh, it's going to take another week. It's like, well, if I had known that task you took was going to take another week or 2 weeks or whatever, I probably would have told you to work on something different because our customers are waiting for things. Right. And that tends to be one of the bigger problems that happens, which is this communication breakdown because nothing is estimated, whether it's points or hours or whatever way people want to do it. And you end up having a massive communication issue. And then you have these sort of fiefdoms that get created. You have engineering, not against, but against product, against sales, against marketing. And everyone's just waiting for product. Everyone's just waiting for things to ship so you can make customers happier.
Right. So one of the alternatives to both of these is to create a buffer. Let's pad the system so that as an engineer, I don't look bad. And, as a product person, you feel like, oh, okay, there's some wiggle room. But we know that also has its shortfalls. Let's talk about those.
Yeah, of course. I think padding is probably one of the worst practices, and you might as well have no estimate.
Okay.
Or no points or anything like that, because you're essentially saying that whatever estimate I give you, I don't know. I don't know. Like, I'm going to pad it. And then you get in this padding mentality. And then you still end up with the same problem that you actually didn't have a real estimate. And things are such a moving target that you failed to ship, you failed to actually do proper planning, and you end up having a business where you're actually not getting the product you need in your customer's hands fast enough so you can actually grow the business. So I think padding leads to a whole different set of issues because what ends up happening in the worst way I can say it, even though I've already said it in pretty aggressive ways, is that everyone's lying to everyone else. And that doesn't help with prioritization or getting anything done either.
Well, thank you for taking the time today to share the shortfalls of these 3 approaches. I can't wait till next time when you unveil your approach for estimates.
Yeah, can't help but share solutions with problems.
Thank you. Now, Heaton and I want to know, have you tried one of these 3 approaches and how have they fell short for you? Let us know in the comments below. And that's it for this week's episode. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel to receive the next episode where Heaton is going to dive into his approach for doing estimates. Ciao for now. This episode of Build is brought to you by our sponsor, Pivotal Tracker.